This is the fourth and final segment of Module 1 in which I'll talk about social stressors and stress, and specifically how stress is another mechanism, and one specifically by which the social or external factors are understood to get under the skin. And we'll be reflecting here what is often referred to as social stress theory, which very simply means basically that things that happen in the social world that are socially patterned or a function of one's location and social structure can affect health outcomes by virtue of exposing individuals to stressors that then affect health through psychological or physiological pathways. Here's the same schematic we saw previously in the segment on direct and indirect effects. So here we'll be focusing more on this relationship between social structure and health via the stress pathway, which is often referred to as the relatively more direct pathway by which social factors affect health. But of course, it's also not the only way by which social factors get under the skin and affect the physiology. So, for example, if one is exposed to noxious agents in the environment, lead, chemicals through the workplace, things that are socially patterned of that nature, also things like engagement in unhealthy behaviors. These things are socially patterned and are also obviously ways by which social factors affect health and get under the skin. We'll be talking more about this specific pathway. And this specific pathway also gets more complex, as we discussed last time. So another caveat on the idea that this is a direct pathway between social structure and health needs to recognize that there are also other factors on the pathway between stress and health, like engagement in health behaviors. For example, coping responses to stress can also be part of this pathway that may manifest through things like health behaviors, and comfort eating, engaging in behaviors that are a form of self-medication to respond to stressful exposures. So again, to refer to this as a completely direct, unmediated pathway is a little bit incomplete or a misnomer, because there are several mechanisms that are operative here through this pathway as well. Okay, so if we're going to start with this simplistic model, we'll first make it more complex by recognizing an important distinction between social stressors and stress. Social stressors are the things that one is exposed to, events, occurrences, etc., typically thought of as things in the environment that are social and external to the individual, and that are similarly socially patterned. And then the social stressors are things that generate or don't a level of stress experienced by the individual psychologically and physiologically, which then go on to impact health. So we need to make this distinction between social stressors, things that are typically outside of the body, and the experience of stress, something that's typically happening within the body. Another dimension that we want to add to this model here, and we'll talk about in this segment, is the role of stress responses or reactivity, and how this factor or set of factors can modify the relationship between social stressors and stress, and between stress and health, whereby, for example, how one individual responds to the exposure to a stressor will impact the degree or nature of the way that social stressor translates into stress. And similarly, the response or reactivity to a stress experience will impact or modify, potentially ameliorate or exacerbate the impact of that stress experience on health outcomes. And so when we're interested in thinking about social group differences in health, or the way social structure, social factors influence health, we really need to think about stress mechanisms as reflecting two processes. One is differential exposure, that certain social groups may experience different likelihoods of being exposed to stressful events, and also differential exposure to chronic, ongoing stressors. And we'll define that distinction between stressful events and chronic stressors in a moment. So one way by which social group differences in health via stress may manifest is because different social groups have differential exposure to stressors in the first place. And the other dimension is that social groups may experience differential vulnerability or reactivity in the stress response to exposure to stressors. And that can reflect differential response to a stressor challenge as a function of something inherited or over time acquired and learned. Also refers to differential types of coping responses and access to the resources that enable coping responses, which may be internal, psychological, or external, meaning reaching out to and making use of external resources to facilitate coping. And that Stiles' coping responses can be both more or less healthy versus toxic or noxious, and subsequently either ameliorate the effect of stressor exposure or exacerbate the effects of that. We also need to think about several different dimensions or ways of characterizing stressors and stress. In humans, human stressors are typically thought of to include a whole array of complex life events related to adversity in a whole bunch of life domains, problems with relationships, health, finances, work, etc. So one dimension or a way of characterizing stressors refers to those which are conceived of more like major life events such as divorce, major illness, loss of a job, being fired, etc. In contrast to things that are more characterized as ongoing daily hassles, everyday indignities, excuse me, things that are perhaps not as momentous as life events, but are referred to more ongoing everyday types of insults or struggles that are stressful in nature. Another dimension is the extent to which stressors are acute versus chronic and sustained. And that distinction between a chronic stressor and an acute stressor can correspond very neatly to the distinction between major life events, which tend to be more acute, and daily hassles, which tend to be more chronic and sustained. But however, that's not a completely clean correspondence. For example, several types of major life events can be both acute and chronic and sustained. If it's a sustained serious illness, for example, long-term disability, that is a major life event that then takes on a chronic nature. And daily hassles may seem relatively more minor, but can have both acute and chronic dimensions as well. Another dimension is the extent to which stressors are objective, meaning they are exogenous to the individual and often referred to as things that are environmental. They are happening outside of the person, as compared to those that are a little bit more subjective in nature. And again, the distinction here gets blurred in our assessment of stressors because often it is very hard to elicit from individuals something that is purely objective, that is an event that has occurred, happened to somebody, without it being conflated somewhat with their subjective perception of that event. Another dimension is the extent to which the particular kind of stressor of interest is universally versus variably relevant to individuals, which has important implications for the content validity of measures we use to capture stress exposure or exposure to stressors. So what this means is the experience of a stressor as, for example, somebody who is being chronically belittled in a hypermasculine work environment is different from the kind of stressor where you're being repeatedly followed around suspiciously in a store by the store manager, compared to the stressor that looks something like being rendered invisible by your colleagues by virtue of your nationality of origin. And these are very relatively specific kinds of stressors that don't apply universally across the board, but are much more likely to be relevant depending on, in this case, your gender or race ethnicity. And if one is especially interested in trying to understand social group differences in exposures to stressors and therefore effects on stress and health, one needs to make sure that one's measures have the right kind of array of stressors and different types of stressors that might be differentially relevant for different subgroups. Another is the extent to which responses to or the effects of stressor exposures are specific versus generalized. And here we can think of this in terms of the health consequences, exposure to certain stressors, for example, may be related to cardiovascular disease. But the effects may also be more generalized, generating, for example, a more generalized susceptibility or vulnerability through, for example, a compromised immune system, which then makes individuals vulnerable to subsequent health exposures, events, etc., and that overall immune compromised effect of stressor responses is more generalized versus something that is more etiologically specific. And finally, we can also refer to this dimension of stressors and stress, the extent to which they are, again, potentially additive, interactive, and amplifying over time. This refers to the fact that often exposures to stressors are not interdependent, and the effects of being exposed to stressors and stress may ultimately be synergistic over time. Okay, I'd just like to flesh this out a bit more, provide some examples of the types of social stressors that are often used in social epidemiology and related research. There are many different checklists and inventories of major life events. One of the earliest and most frequently used is the Schedule of Recent Events, which was created in 1967 and just provides a list of many different kinds of potential events that are endorsed as having happened or not in the past 12 months, and includes things from marriage, divorce, job loss, and relocation, all the way down to things that are more or less severe. And the severity distinction is captured through a point allocation that corresponds to each of the events listed. Others, such as the alcohol use disorder and associated disabilities interview, Schedule 4, is an example of an instrument that incorporates scales of life event stressors. And some of these differentiate the events a priori between minor and major events, and then just simply aggregate a count of the extent to which individuals have experienced these events in the past 12 months. I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on one particular kind of psychosocial stressor that has generated a lot more research and been very relevant in social epidemiology, and in which you heard a little bit about, or will when you look at the unnatural causes video with reference to the Whitehall study. And that pertains to studies of working conditions as social stressors. Working conditions as social stressors are a well-studied psychosocial occupational exposure. Occupational exposure distinct from those that are typically thought of as part of occupational health, like exposure to noxious agents in the environment in the workplace, ergonomic strain, injury on the job, and so forth. And this dimension of social stressors in the workplace is relatively advanced in terms of measurement, and much of it is focused on cardiovascular disease outcomes in the UK and Scandinavian countries. And the more prominent of the measures and constructs used to characterize the psychosocial work environment as a stressor is Karasyk's demand control model. The demand control model has two dimensions, primary dimensions. The first is decision latitude, which is the control dimension, which refers to, again, subsetted as skill discretion and decision authority. And the skill discretion refers to things like how much you get to use skills on the job and creativity, flexibility that you have performing your work. Decision authority refers to things like how much you have the freedom to make decisions and how much freedom you have to choose how to perform your work and have a degree of say on the job. The second dimension is the demand dimension, referring to things like excessive amounts of work, whether you experience conflicting demands, whether the work is paced at a difficult pace and you have insufficient time to complete tasks, etc. And there's a third dimension that was added subsequently by Johnson to capture the degree of social support accessed in the workplace, both by coworkers and supervisors. And these two dimensions, the control dimension and the demand dimension, are intersected in this way to create 4 quadrants of relative risk. You can see here some examples of professions that have been allocated to these 4 quadrants. The farmer here, I think, refers to much more of the idea of an independent farmer-owned farm rather than the downtrodden farm worker, but gives you some sense of the kinds of occupations that are arrayed in along these 2 dimensions. So down here in this quadrant here is the high demand and low control quadrant. And this quadrant is referred to as job strain and has been hypothesized to and demonstrated to be the highest quadrant, the highest risk quadrant associated with most often cardiovascular disease related outcomes. This quadrant here, low strain, high demand, high control, and low demand, is the reference group lowest risk category, with these 2 quadrants arrayed intermediately in terms of risk between low strain and high strain. So many studies looking at cardiovascular related outcomes and others just focus on the job strain quadrant relative to the other 3. Some pull the dimensions out, like this particular study done on the Whitehall cohort. This is contrasting self-reported, self-assessed degree of job control using the Karasik instrument and an external assessor's assessment of the degree of job control experienced by individuals. And they're simply rated as low, intermediate, and high levels of job control. Here you can see there's a close correspondence between the self-assessed Karasik instrument results and those done by an external assessor, and then you find that there's this nice stepwise relationship with higher odds ratios of coronary heart disease being associated with those having the lowest levels of job control, followed by intermediate and high levels of job control. Here's another example from Whitehall looking at coronary heart disease. Here both dimensions are incorporated to look at the effect of job strain. This is the job strain quadrant here, demonstrating the highest hazard ratio for coronary heart disease relative to the low strain quadrant, with intermediate risks shown here for the other 2 quadrants. There are other models of workplace psychosocial stressors, and one of those that is less popular but has been studied a fair degree is seek-risk effort reward imbalance. And here the construct is basically trying to capture things like the degree of effort that is put into a particular job and the extent to which it matches or exceeds the amount of rewards achieved through a particular job. When effort exceeds reward, this is considered imbalanced and producing a stress exposure. And the correction of that stress exposure can happen through calibration in either direction. So decreased effort to be commensurate with the reward, or increasing reward to be commensurate with effort. And unlike the job strain model, this takes into account things like salaries and possibilities for promotion that factor much more into this reward concept. And the model here is a little bit closer to the traditional, if those of you familiar with it, person, environment, fit kinds of approaches that Karasik's model explicitly avoids. And it's far less popular than the job strain model in the literature, but again, it is probably the second one most commonly used. Here you can see how the quadrants line up and the complementariness of the 2 here in the effort-reward imbalance model. This quadrant, again, is that which is perceived to be the most stressful, where there's high effort but low reward, and compared to these other 3 quadrants, as the job strain quadrant here compares to the others in the Karasik model. And here you can see an example of how the 2 measures match up. These are each adjusted for each other, and you can see the risk here is of myocardial infarction in men and women aged 45 to 64. And you can see elevated risk for both. It's fairly comparable using the job strain instrument. Interestingly, the effort reward imbalance does not show comparable findings for men and women, quite different, and the combination of the two, this kind of nulls it out for women, but you do see this significantly elevated risk among men.